Our last speaker is Bindu Mohanty, Ph.D. She is a writer, educator, and sustainability consultant based in Auroville. As a consultant, she has worked in the fields of rural development, climate justice, and waste management. As an educator, she has served as senior faculty for an international study abroad program and taught workshops and courses in India, the United States, and Europe. Her writings have been published in academic and other forums, and she is passionate about promoting social justice and ecological sustainability in a globalized world through her work. In Auroville, she has served the community by working in rural development, waste management, food security, and governance. She has represented Auroville at numerous international conferences, and we're fortunate to have her here today. Please welcome Bindu Mohanty.
Thank you, Nick. I was actually going to start out with a series of disclaimers to justify my spot here. But Robert tells me that apparently women apologize twice as more as men. So I'm not going to apologize. I'm just going to claim my space and delve into my talk. However, I just would like to preface it by saying that I will continue on this theme of what I think is the fourth phase of the counterculture movement, communal living. And also I'd like to bring about East-West psychological perspectives to it in terms of evolutionary spirituality, because I am an East-West psychology department graduate, and look at see the experimentation with communal living as a historical arc.
Hold the mic, Bindu.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Linda. Yeah. And also, I'll be continuing on some of the themes that we've already visited in the last day of the first day of the conference, and yeah, maybe revisit and deepen it. So, I would like to start by saying that even though the communes of 1968 counterculture were short-lived, the lineage still lives on. This was mentioned yesterday as well. Worldwide, there is still widespread experimentation with intentional communities. And as was said, that this today takes the form of eco-villages, where I know that the hippie communes also, as you were sharing, had experimented with sustainable living, but eco-villages, the primary orientation is sustainable living. And instead of, as they were also experimenting with polyamorous and different forms of alternate social living. And actually recently I was visiting Sieben-Linden just before I came to the States in Germany, one of the bigger eco-villages in India. And the resident, my friend there, Iris, was saying that they are having intense dialogues about what they call community version 2.0, like sharing knowledge about how to sustain communities, because all intentional communities actually kind of have similar problems of consensus, problems of having decision making, and so on. She was inviting me to join the dialogue, but I said, you know what, I really don't believe in eco-villages, because I think the world is at a place where we need more larger scale solution. And as a global citizen, I really want to work for what would work for the entire planet, not, as Suryamai was mentioning, an insular little eco-village. But what I would like to state is, revolutionary counterculture movement that give birth to communal living arise due to people's dissatisfaction with mainstream society. If people were happy with mainstream society, there would be no reason for them to break away and to start something. So, communal living or counterculture will always coexist in a dialectical tension with mainstream society and mainstream culture. And even if a commune dies out, like Morningstar, its value will permeate mainstream society, till there's perhaps another revolution and another evolutionary spiral arc of the society. So in revisiting the events of the global movement of 1968, we need to ask this question once more. What was the disenchantment with society? Was the revolution complete in itself, or do we still need to take up the cause of the revolution? And we've already mentioned our dissatisfaction with capitalism, perhaps with democracy, and a disenchantment with industrial culture. And I would like to explore that idea a bit further. The Industrial Revolution, riding on the success of science and technology, has turned us into homogenized units, units that can be controlled. It has robbed us of a basic humanity to the extent that we forget within we're actually vast, free individuals, as vast as free as the universe itself. As George mentioned yesterday, the overarching goal, like the most profound aim of the counterculture revolution, was the people's demand for freedom to create new human beings. And I think that's a goal we should not lose sight of, our need to create new human beings. We do not know our own human potential. Why should we be slave to the needs of a capitalistic industrial society to behave in certain ways? Why should we have to work so hard just to make our ends meet? Or consent to be corporate consumers that the corporates sell stuff and get more stuff? If anything, I think there is a greater need for revolution today, 50 years later, than in 1968. But I think what we need first is an internal revolution. We need to go within to seize the values that we want to live by. And this is what the internal revolution or the inner revolution is, I think, a spiritual revolution. And it's only when sufficient number of individuals, this is just a hypothesis I'm throwing out at you all, only when sufficient numbers of individuals do that, then I believe we will have lasting changes in mainstream society. And these ideas are of course not new. Sociologists see the arc of social evolution as going from hunter-gatherer and agricultural societies with a religious worldview to an industrial society with a secular worldview, and they also posit a post-industrial society and see emerging signs of a post-secular spiritual society. We need to define this term a bit, post-secularism, because what is really important is the differentiation of modernity, the differentiation of religion and the secular spheres of science, arts, governance and morals. That's a very, very important differentiation we should not lose track of. And that must be complete. Because without it, we'll just collapse into a religious outlook with all its problems. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was printed on single sheets. So where was I? Post-secular spirituality. Since 1968, I mean, this has again been studied sociologically, we see increasing number of individuals, often called cultural creatives, who are looking for a deeper meaning in their life, but it's still not strong enough to bring a socio-political change. So I would like to offer one insight coming from Bindu about what could a post-secular spirituality look like. Bindu holds that the three ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality and fraternity, which are also the ideals of the 1968 revolution, have so far only been sought to realize as mental ideals and not ideas of the soul. And these ideals have only been imperfectly worked out in the socio-political realm. Broadly speaking, I would say the idea of liberty was seized by USA, and it was worked out in two ways as a capitalistic democracy. Democracy with its one person, one vote formula granted political equality to the citizens, and capitalism granted economic freedom to the individual, but now, as you can see, increasingly in the United States, it has actually resulted in a greater inequality. Soviet Union ran off with the other ideal of the French Revolution, equality, and they sought to have economic equality among the citizens. But the corruption inherent in the Communist Party greatly restricted individual liberty. So you see, you're sacrificing liberty if you want to achieve equality. And if you are giving rein to liberty, you're resulting in inequality. And lastly, the ideal of fraternity is yet to be experimented upon at the level of a nation state. I know that the French constitution actually has got all these three ideals, but it's not really worked out in a socio-political realm. But this was the very ideals that the communes embraced, the ideal of fraternity, of brotherhood. And one very famous example where you see it most clearly is from this German commune, K1. I think it was started in 67 maybe. And its leader, Kunzelmann, denounced the idea of a nuclear family. He saw the patriarchal nuclear family as the smallest unit of the patriarchal nation state. And thus he sought to create a new social reality, that of the commune, where there was not just a sense of fraternity, but also of liberty and equality. His manifesto was that fascism develops from the nuclear family. It is the smallest cell of the state from whose oppressive character all institutions are derived. In nuclear family, men and women live in dependence on each other, so neither develop as freely as people. So he wanted this cell, that is of the small nuclear family, to be shattered, and the alternative he offered, no prizes for a guess, was polyamorous communities. But this commune K1 did not last more than 2 years. And one of the reasons why it did not last was that Kunzelmann himself, the leader who wrote this manifesto, started acting as an autocratic patriarch.
Oh.
And this only just goes to prove my point that unless you have an inner spiritual, psychological revolution, an outer change won't be lasting. So what does the soul quality of fraternity or brotherhood looks like? Fraternities are sorority. Now, actually, if you think about it, the ideal of brotherhood is very strong in the Abrahamic religions. Islam is big on fraternity, so is Christianity, Christian brotherhood. But of course, it does not go beyond that religious community. It still does not have that post-secular spirituality connotation that I'm talking about. So for a spiritual definition of fraternity, we have to look deeper. And Sri Aurobindo says that you can see these ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity as a triune Godhead. That's the only way to understand them. So Sri Aurobindo, he holds that the soul has a universal aspect to it. He says that there is no difference between a human being and a tree, for they're both animated by the same divine spirit. And that gives us the soul quality of equality. So at the level of souls, we're all equals. Let me just state a small story around this. We were talking yesterday about how in Auroville, the children are not really preached at with Sri Aurobindo or the Life Divine or something like that, but they somehow manage to imbibe these values or ideals. So as part of my dissertation, I was interviewing this young girl who grew up in Auroville, and I asked her the simple question, what does spirituality mean to you? And she said, spirituality means to me like an interconnection, that I'm somehow connected to everything, that I may be more intelligent than an animal, but I'm not more important than an animal. And that to me was profound, that somebody just speaks so simply and openly about this idea that we're actually one, without it being an academic, intellectual idea. Continuing on to the ideal of liberty, this is extremely important to Sri Aurobindo. He actually, in his evolutionary philosophy, for him the individual is the motor of evolution. Thus he espouses the ideal of liberty for people to discover their true individuality. He distinguishes true individuality as the individuality of the ego, or the socially constructed ego, what you could say. And true individuality means the psychic being or the soul. Fraternity, the third ideal, I believe is the basis of a perfect society. Societies, if you think about it, exist in this dialectical tension between the individual and the collective. You either feel oppressed by the society or you do not kind of belong there. And Shubhana's idea of the perfect society is that where the individual and the society are complementary and mutually fulfilling terms. In the perfect society, the ultimate fulfillment of the individual growth comes from being part of a society, and society in turn grows stronger and better with individuated individuals. And because individuality is a key to a perfect society, fraternity in a spiritual sense does not mean a homogeneous unity. It means a differentiated unity. You know, like that of an ecosystem or a rainforest where every species finds its niche and there's room for everybody. And that's the goal that we have in Auroville. And so basically what I'm getting at here, if you think about it, it's only when we fully live in this spiritual ideal of fraternity, we will hold the dialectical opposition between liberty and equality together. Because then you have got liberty and equality being held in this idea of brotherhood. So I would like to just conclude that consciously or unconsciously, Auroville, as a social experiment of Shubhana's vision, is seeking to live out the spiritual notion of fraternity. I'll not go into details right now, but just share one interesting fact about Auroville. And this is the fact that the mother actually wanted Auroville to be an autonomous city-state. It's a bit sad that Auroville is increasingly being co-opted as the project of Government of India, but we actually wanted to be autonomous. But we got into trouble with the Government of India when one Aurovillian made public statements about it. And if you think about why a city-state, you realize that if we can implement this triune godhead of fraternity, liberty, and equality in a city-state, then we have hoped to implement it at a larger scale, at a nation-state. So these are just some ideas that I'd like to throw out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bindu. I think we'll start with a few quick questions amongst the panel, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. I think I will start, I'd like to start with Ramon, if I could. And Ramon actually was gracious enough to give me a couple of questions ahead of time and said that these would be good ones that would lead into more. One of them in particular appealed to me because one thing that he didn't really touch on in his talk is the degree to which he was a leading light and founder of a San Francisco counterculture institution called the Tape Music Center. And what I'd like to do is ask him sort of a hybrid of the question that he suggested to me and ask him to address a little bit of his experience with the Tape Music Center and how that sort of fit into your experience with Morningstar and with Wheeler.
Well, that's a good one. One thing I want to say, well, maybe I'll say it as I go along. I was a student at the San Francisco Conservatory and getting more and more interested in using electronic music, creating electronic music. And so I built a little studio in the attic and invited my three close friends, Terry Riley, Paulino Riveros, and Phil Windsor, to create pieces there for what was going to be our first concert of a series I titled Sonics. And it was a very, very basic studio. It was a couple of tape recorders, some things to bang on, and so forth, and Echoplex. Anyway, we did get some pieces done, and then for the first concert, we made it a bring your own speaker. So people were invited to bring their speakers, and we wired them to a dummy practice keyboard, and the composer could sit at the keyboard and play his sounds around the room. The next concerts evolved into using performers from the Anna Halpern dance group and doing improv. We were very much into improvisation. And then at the end of the year, we had quite a successful series. And when I realized that the director was not going to fund us for a second year, and I was also graduating, by then Mort Subotnick, another composer, had become involved. And so I went to Mort and I said, look, you have a basement full of stuff. I have an attic full of stuff. Let's combine them and go someplace and do our own thing. So we did. And out of that, we incorporated the San Francisco Tape Music Center, and various of our composer friends worked there with us. And we did monthly concerts out of our house, our auditorium at 321 Divisadero. And I sublet to Anna Halpern's dancers one room, and I asked KPFA to share the auditorium with us, and between those groups they paid our rent, and all we had to do was make enough money from our concerts to pay the utilities. And we chugged along like that for 3-4 years, not doing very well in fundraising. And but then finally there came a point when the Rockefeller Foundation came along and said, well, we'll give you a small grant, but if you want a really big grant, you're going to have to associate yourself with a institution of learning. So Mort taught at Mills, and I just got my MA there, and Mills, Mr. Millot was their wonderful man on campus, and he loved the idea of us moving there, so between all of this, we moved the center to Mills College, where to this day it still survives, now renamed as the Center for Contemporary Music. So that's basically it, but I must tell you, early on we discovered that to give a concert of tape music, you're eliminating one element that you don't really realize is important, and that is the visual. When you go to a concert of music, you like looking at the performers. We didn't have any performers. So I had heard of these two gentlemen doing light show stuff, and I approached one of them, and he did a show for us, but I don't think he particularly liked our music, so he wandered off, and then I approached Mr. Bill Ham, and he was the second one, and he did a show for us, and then emigrated to Europe. So then I finally got a friend of mine who was an abstract painter, Anthony Martin, and I said, Tony, you've got to do this for us, please. And he, oh, I'm not really interested. Or, I got him to do it. And then over time he caught on, and he became actually one of Bill Graham's light show people at the Fillmore later. But anyway, I just want to say that before the rock bands started using light projections, we were there and doing them happily. So that's kind of the story of the Tape Center. Is that all you wanted? Yes? Yes.
No, that's great. Thank you, Ramon, very much.
Oh, and by the way, there is a book that finally came out through UC Berkeley called the San Francisco Tape Music Center, and it has a lot of interviews and pictures and photos and whatnot.
And a CD, recommended. My next question is for Peter, and Peter, this is kind of a curveball in the sense that it hauls you back to graduate school. One thing that cultural historians always get confronted with is the idea of continuity versus discontinuity in American history. And since your talk dealt extensively with the idea of countercultural legacies, question for you is, and especially since you brought some of those into today, do you see more continuity or discontinuity, both locally and nationally, in the counterculture?
I guess I would put the emphasis on not only the continuity, but also the collaboration. I mean, especially listening to Ramon speaking today, I think the thing that characterizes this place during that period is its cultural remoteness, for one thing. I mean, San Francisco was commercially connected, but there were no important cultural capitals for hundreds of miles in any other direction. And there were no markets that, you know, to which, or patrons, really, as Ramon was just saying, to appeal to. You know, somebody who could fund a project was very difficult to find. And what you get instead are very small, vibrant, highly collaborative little subcultures with a lot of overlap. And I mentioned some of them in Ramon's. We could keep doing that. There were ways in which one thing was leading to another, but the overall community was I wouldn't say insular, but most people from the outside that came and observed it said, "Wow, these people are working together, you know, and really and creating new and interesting things." And so, in a way, that's the thing that would be the big point. I think that made that period, that year, kind of special. That didn't endure. That didn't last forever. In many ways, it lasted longer than people thought. I think some of these legacies kind of came and went, but some of them just kept rolling on. And I don't think you can really understand San Francisco today without understanding, you know, the enduring legacy of that period and those experiments and the ones that really took off. I would say, you know, in many ways, the one we're still living with, not always happily, is the tech piece that came out of the Whole Earth Catalog and sort of blossomed into the kind of techno-utopianism that we see and some people are increasingly kind of skeptical about. And that might be, you might call that a rupture, because I mean, one thing that you see with this so-called Californian ideology is the outward-facing rhetoric is hippie happy talk that you can trace back to the 60s and 70s. It's all about community, it's all about connection, and so on. You know, that's a powerful rhetoric that can be appealed to and directed productively around here. But when you put a little pressure on some of these outfits, you know, the other principles and the other values are not only not honored, but they're violated, you know, regularly. So I think it's the usual blend. I mean, not predictable, but there's the usual blend of continuity and discontinuity. And, you know, things don't stay the same. But, you know, I don't think you're going to understand this area very well if you don't understand this history. But it often gets perverted, I guess. The ultimate perversion, perhaps, is, you know, arrives in the 1970s with People's Temple. I mean, you know,
What?
to hear that.
People's Temple.
People's
Oh,
Temple.
right.
To hear that, you know, the appeal, and you can see the appeal. You know, it's what I was talking about earlier. It was ecstasy in community. It was ecstatic rapture in community. But it was diabolically perverted, you know, in kind of maniacal ways. And you know, that's I don't think you can separate that tragedy, that atrocity, from some of the things that people were doing and feeling, you know, and very optimistic about before that. That was a reality check, in a way, and of course the biggest possible rupture in the value system that we're talking about.
Could I make one comment to that? You hear frequently people say, oh, or the media say, oh yeah, the communes, they're all gone, they folded, and so forth. If you go to a book called the Communal Directory, or the Directory of it's published by the same people who publish Communities magazine. You'll find over 500 communal groups listed in the United States, not to mention the ones in other countries. So the communal movement is alive and doing well. It's just that the media lost interest in them, and which is a good thing, because I think the media did a lot to not help, or rather to destroy some of the things that were going on.
Thank you, Ramon. Thank you, Peter. Ramon, to your point, that is a great segue into the question that I've got for you, which is a wonderful contrast between Ramon's discussion of Morningstar, your discussion of Auroville. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about whether there's a parallel in the experience that Auroville had with Indian authorities and what Ramon described with conflicts with Sonoma County and with the state.
Let me begin by saying that we fully subscribe to this value of open land. In Auroville, we do not own any of the immovable assets, land, buildings. They're communally owned, not owned by one person. No, actually, we have a different experience in India with our issues with the government, which is, it's hard to say, it's such a mixed bag. You see, what happened was, ours was a community with a very strong spiritual basis. It was started by a charismatic spiritual leader, the mother, the spiritual partner, Bindu. But she passed away within 5 years of starting the community, which personally actually I think is a very good thing, because it ensured that we did not fall into a cult and guru or anything like that, but we're free to find our own path. But as happens with any spiritual community, once the leader passes away, there is a period of chaos. So actually there was a sort of quote-unquote civil war that broke out about who controls the assets of Auroville. And this we are greatly indebted to Indian government. They actually stepped in and passed an act of parliament, both houses of the Indian government voting to pass this as law, saying, testifying to Auroville's spiritual legacy of not belonging to anyone but to humanity as a whole. So this is again something about India, and very different, very radical from other governments, like to actually give that recognition, to actually give that much reverence to Bindu as a spiritual guru. However, what happened was, because of that act, they put a body called the Auroville Foundation, an autonomous government institution, in charge of Auroville as the legal holder of all the assets of Auroville. And since then, while that has brought out many good things, but it has also meant that we are accountable to the government of India. And yeah, which is both good and bad.
Well, thank you, that's great. Questions from the audience? We've got a few minutes.
I'll go after Sean.
Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go for it, go for it. She's right there.
Well, thank you, all three of you, so rich. Since I can't ask 3 questions, I'm going to ask Bindu you a question. Your discussion of the Holy Trinity of French Republic, Bindu's deep and lovely gloss on that, was that mostly in the human cycle, the ideal of human unity? Where is that?
I'm going to pass that question straight to my mentor, Devashish.
It's in the social writing, the ideal of human unity and human cycle.
I was going to get that, but I
So,
wanted to
it's specifically in the book Aphorism and Thought.
Sorry?
There is one book by Bindu, Aphorism and Thought,
Oh,
and there is one special thought about that, the liberty, equality, and fraternity.
I look forward to further discussions with you about it.
Thank you for your presentations. I appreciate it. My question was around the role psychedelics perhaps played in the counterculture. You both mentioned Stuart Brand, and I recently read a book, two books this year, What the Dormouse Said and Michael Pollan's new book, that his inspiration for getting the whole Earth catalog out and putting the Earth on it came from on LSD. And of course, the Grateful Dead, that played a large role, and perhaps Rolling Stones, I'm not sure. And so my question is, do you think the counterculture would have happened without psychedelics, whether both in the Bay Area or the United States as a whole? And then also for you, does or has psychedelics played any role in Auroville, past or present, within the community?
Who wants to jump first?
I should jump first and say whether I don't think so.
I think, and here, I think David Farber, an American historian, would argue that there was something about LSD that kind of kick-started this process. I think if you push it back a little farther, a little further, you see that, pharmaceutically, the beats were different than the hippies, right? But still, there was that it's always sort of on the horizon in these bohemian communities, and not just in America, and often in utopian settings, because there's something about the utopian experience, just cross-culturally and historically, that is largely about transformation, and there's a lot of different ways to achieve that, and a quick way to do it is pharmaceutically, and we're not alone in that. Our culture's not in any way distinctive when it comes to that. So I don't think it can be easily dismissed. I mean, to call it LSD by itself, I think that's an important part of it. But I mean, I think if you look at some of these other bohemian communities, you'd see something a little bit like that. And I was interested in hearing Ramon's observation about ecstasy. When I say ecstatic rapture in community, I'm not talking about MMDA, but I think there's something about that, and maybe this is just one person's opinion, but I think one of the things that happens there, and we heard in Ramon's anecdote, is that it kind of models a certain kind of behavior, and then afterwards you think, why can't we act like that all the time? And I think that was certainly part of what it was for Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. I think they often talked about it as a door that you step through. Do we have to take this all the time to get the same kind of effect?
That I can cut off the conversation without letting Ramon Sindir answer your very good question. Ramon, if we subtract LSD, do we still have the Haight-Ashbury and the counterculture?
Well, I ran across a book called The Fourth Drive, which the author explains how we do have this fourth drive to change our consciousness whenever we want. And over my childhood, I remember watching a farm horse at my school happily rolling on his back with all hooves in the air, having just devoured all the fermenting apples under the tree. And also, there are many species that enjoy getting high in one way or another. So it's out there. And I think it's part of who we are. And looking back at the 60s, I remember the committee was here in town doing shows on Broadway. And I remember going to one of their shows and looking around the audience and thinking, now how many of these people have turned on? And I had the feeling everyone else was doing the same thing. It was 60, what was it? I don't know what year, it was early. And it was just about when LSD was coming into North Beach. But before that, it was peyote, basically. And it was an important part. It was an important part of dissolving yourself of some of your preconceptions and letting the universe inform you of some others.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all for